Tonight, the government's asking us to see the fuel crisis and the goods shortage as a turning point for the new economy. Will voters buy that? And how much pain are we prepared to tolerate until we get there? The Chancellor tells Conference he's a pragmatist who cares about what works. But outside this bubble, there are soldiers driving fuel trucks, farmers facing catastrophe and care homes desperate to find workers to fill their jobs. We ask a minister if this is part of the plan. Also tonight, we now have a levelling up minister. So will we find out what levelling up really means? Hello, good evening from the Conservative Party conference in Manchester. Now, inside the hall, you'll hear this is the party of business and economic responsibility. Beyond the conference gates, there are empty petrol stations, farmers facing livestock culls and businesses desperate for staff. So how do these add up? And has the explanation changed? Last week, the government suggested the petrol shortages weren't real. They were just caused by panic buying. But a week on, many of the pumps in the south of England are still dry and soldiers are driving the HGVs. So today, a pivot. Now we're told that the pain we're feeling as a nation is part of the benefit we'll get down the line. It's the reordering of the economy for a post-Brexit world. So are we prepared to wait out the chaos in the promise of this bright future? And if so, for how long? Well, Nick Watt, our political editor, starts us off. Nick.
Yes, Emily, well, it's quite something that on the opening day of the Conservative Party conference, after 11 years in power, the army is out helping with the distribution of oil. Now, the government is unfazed by this. They're saying, look, there are driver shortages across the EU, though I do have to say that we're not seeing the military elsewhere in the EU doing this sort of thing. But as you say, this is a government, to coin a phrase, that has decided that it is going to take back control of this issue, so it is facing it down. And it is saying, look, this is an economy in transition after COVID and after Brexit, and there will be bumps along the way. But interestingly, I spoke to one minister who knows the Prime Minister's mind well, and this minister told me that his mindset on this was fixed in August when Parliament was recalled over the Afghan pullout, and that the Prime Minister was really taken aback by the fury on his benches over that. And the Prime Minister was heard to say, that was something that was out of my control. I want to focus on things I can control. So today, I've been looking at a Prime Minister and a government doubling down.
Hopefully scenes belonging firmly in the past, an iconic Manchester venue at the heart of the battle against COVID. Now back to its familiar role as a home for politics. If a year is an eternity in a pandemic, then all you need in normal politics is a week. 7 days ago, and the initial government response to shortages at the pumps, it's an immediate problem with a simple solution.
The cause of these current problems is that panic buying episode, and the most important thing is for people to start buying petrol as they normally would.
A Prime Minister on the move and a change of tune firmly entrenched. Opportunities from Brexit will increase driver wages. A remodelling of the economy that might take time to produce results.
I was proud to back Brexit, proud to back Leave.
And who better than the first Brexit-supporting Chancellor to serve notice? Be patient.
Brexit was never just about the things we couldn't do. It was also about the things we didn't do. My point is this. Even if you can't see it yet, I assure you, the future is here.
Row upon row of beds filled this space when it served as a Nightingale hospital at the height of the pandemic. All gone now, thankfully, to be replaced by a return to old ways and the sign of a government seeking to show how a crisis at the pumps can serve as an opportunity. Great, one leading Brexiteer told me, as the government talks about how higher wages are the answer. Pity there wasn't much of a strategy, this MP moaned, talking about how the government appears to have stumbled into one. Nadeem Zahawi.
How are you?
Cabinet Brexiteers are echoing the message. There is change, and it will take time.
But are we seeing more openness that, yes, there will be opportunities, but it will take time? For example, the fuel shortages, it's going to be an issue of dealing with wages, not just going for sort of cheap immigration.
So let me try and bring it to life for you. What I think is beginning to happen, and because I was Business and Industry Minister in Bays, and then took on the vaccine role, and of course now in education, you're already beginning to see a transformation of a number of sectors. What Boris is signalling, rightly so, is to say, look, you need to think about how you invest in your business. There's no longer a pool of cheap labour, right? And when that is no longer there, your CFO suddenly says, actually, you know what? The investment in technology and upskilling is worth it. So let's do it. And that's the transition we're seeing.
So transition with some pain along the way?
No, I think with lots of gain.
Of course, it doesn't turn overnight. In the same way that it takes 7 years to create a doctor, it will take a number of years to create a nuclear engineer and a number of years for a factory to be at full pelt making wind turbine blades. So all of these take time, but I think there is a real sense of excitement in the government, and the Prime Minister is leading on all those things that the UK can now do now that we are free of those EU frameworks.
A former Remainer who's switched sides under the influence of his son sees upsides.
Okay, the position the Prime Minister took was very good, because he's basically saying the pluses here are, yes, there may be shortages as some of the drivers, some of the low-paid workers, some of the Eastern Europeans, quote-unquote, no prejudice intended, don't come. But what is the upside? The upside is that British workers will be getting high-paid jobs, and of course there's a huge challenge now to make sure it can't be that difficult to drive a heavy goods vehicle. Don't tell me they're not up to it. I drive tractors and stuff like that.
But it's quite a gamble, isn't it? Because it may not work, or it does work. And what do increased wages mean? They mean inflation.
Not necessarily. Inflation is a function of supply and demand. That is the issue. And if supply is there, there won't be inflation.
Winding down and pausing for reflection. The normal rhythm of a conference in a once extraordinary location.
Nick Watt there. So will this shortage of supplies and workers, now felt across many industries, really lead to a better economy? The logic says that if demand is higher, wages go up. But businesses are wondering where that money will come from. And if the higher costs are passed on to the consumer, then is the economy actually growing at all? Here's Seema Katecha with the numbers.
It's conference season, and there are lots of things being said by politicians in speeches and in interviews. But here on Newsnight, we're going to tell you some of what's fact and what's not. Starting with wages. Here's what the Chancellor said earlier.
Wages are rising, and that is a good thing. That's a positive thing. We want to see that. That is the best protection against cost of living challenges for families if their wages are rising.
Of course, wages fell at the beginning of the pandemic because people worked fewer hours or went on furlough, where the government paid 80% of their wages and then later 60%. Take a look at this graph. You can see wages increasing last autumn into this year as more people returned to work. But the average earning figures we're seeing now are being compared to those at the height of the pandemic in 2020, making that annual increase in wages look misleadingly a lot bigger. Now, another factor that has driven up average earnings is the impact of the pandemic on low-paid workers. More of them have lost their jobs over the last 18 months. Having more people in higher-paid jobs pushes up the average earnings figure. The state of the labour market is complex, which makes it difficult to work out exactly what the real trends are. Ministers decided to suspend the pensions triple lock this year because of those challenges. Even the government said the figures were skewed and distorted because of that complex backdrop. ONS data shows in the 3 months to this July, average weekly real wages, which take into account inflation, fell from £491 in April to £488 in July. Some analysts say some data does point to strong wage growth at 6% for the year.
But overall, if you look at what's actually happening to most workers, wage growth is probably nearer half that, say 3-4%. And obviously inflation is now creeping up. It's at 3%. It's expected to get to 4% by the end of the year. So big picture in terms of what's happening to wages, they're broadly flat, with prices rising as well as wages increasing.
Now, over the weekend, Boris Johnson made this statement.
What you've got at the moment is a shortage of lorry drivers, shortage of truck drivers that's affecting the whole world. There's even a shortage of truck drivers in China. There's a shortage in America and in Poland.
Poland has a shortage of around 120,000 drivers, compared with the British shortfall of around 100,000. But there's been no significant disruption to their supply chains. Industry experts tell us its access to the single market means drivers from neighbouring countries can easily come over to help with their logistics. Britain now has a smaller pool of drivers because of tighter immigration controls after Brexit, while reform to tax legislation has drastically reduced incomes for agency workers. Tens of thousands of HGV driving tests were cancelled last year due to the pandemic, exacerbating an existing shortage. Australia and Central Asia have reported HGV driver shortages of 20% due to a surge in demand for goods during the pandemic. Logistics experts say the only place that doesn't have a significant shortage of drivers is Africa. However, nowhere else apart from here are we seeing queues outside petrol stations, raising questions as to what happened here that didn't happen elsewhere.
Seema Kotecha. Joining us now is Lucy Fraser, the Financial Secretary to the Treasury. Nice you join us, Lucy. And your boss this morning kept talking about this global supply issue, yet we're the only country with soldiers driving HGVs and petrol pumps closed for business because they've run dry.
Well, you're right to say, as the Chancellor was right to say, this is a global issue, and the reason it's a global issue is because we had a very slow economy during the pandemic, and a number of businesses were shut. And now what we see when the economy has opened again is a significant
Forgive me for coming in, but I actually said the opposite, which is that many countries are facing the same issues, but no other country is facing these shortages, where we're seeing the army driving HGV trucks and petrol stations closed because they've run out.
Yeah, Emily, if you could just let me finish. I think we were saying the same thing. So there are global issues, and what is happening here is there is sufficient supply of petrol and in the refineries, but it's not spread across the country. That's why we're seeing the
army driving trucks.
That's why we've seen the pictures in the paper of people queuing, and I understand the frustration of those people who are queuing. But there is sufficient supply in the country. It's about where do you get it
Lucy,
from?
but you know it's not
army,
just know it's not just fuel. You know it's the farmers who are at the end of their tether because they will lose a whole year's worth of livestock having to cull pigs because there aren't enough butchers to come in. You know it's affecting the harvest of daffodils is the next one. 270 million daffodil stems left unharvested because they can't get the seasonal workers to do that. These are all businesses and industries. We could go on and talk about hospitality. We could go on and talk about the care homes. It's not just one sector. It's not just fuel.
Well, I'd like to come to the detail of some of the things you've made, because there are answers to be made on the detail. But the broad issue is there are issues globally, and we, the government, are taking several measures to tackle that. Yeah. I mean, just to pick up on a couple of things you said, because I wouldn't want the public to not understand the entire position. So you mentioned pig farming and butchers has been talked about in that context. So, in fact, butchers is a skilled profession that is on the list, and people can come here. So that isn't an issue. It isn't an issue about people not coming here.
So just explain then. No, I'm really interested in that, because we know that from the Times front page, I don't know if we can bring it up, that there are offers of visas for some sectors, HGV being one, and you say pig farmers being the other. Only 27 visas have been applied for from EU workers.
So that tells you something, doesn't it?
It
that
does.
tells you that that isn't necessarily the answer. The answer is, and this is what the Chancellor was talking...
The 6 months...
If I could just finish.
The 6 months
what
probably
the Chancellor was
answer.
talking about today is that, and what the Prime Minister has said on many, many occasions, is the answer isn't to have uncontrolled immigration coming into this,
why is that
into this
uncontrolled?
country.
Sorry, why is that
to allow low wages, which we've had over the course of a number of years. The answer is to ensure that we skill up the people that we have in this country. We've got 1 million vacancies. We need to ensure that the vacancies match the skills. And that is what the Chancellor's speech today was all about, making sure that we provide jobs for people in this country.
Anne-Marie Trevelyan was talking about the length of time that will be needed. She used the example of a doctor that could take 7 years to skill up. So I guess that the simple question that the public would ask you is, how long do they have to wait for this new economy to take shape? How much pain will they have to see before that happens?
It's already starting. So the Chancellor outlined the extension of a number of schemes which are already in operation. So he talked, for example, about the Kickstart scheme.
Sorry,
Young
just not to talk about the schemes.
If I could just finish, if I could.
Just let's get back to the
question.
It's about the pain. How long will people have to sit out the pain? Whatever that is, whether it's in hospitality, whether it's in care homes, whether it's in trying to get fuel, whether it's in seeing a rise in their food prices, which we know are going up because of shortages, how long should they sit out that pain for?
Well, if I could just answer the question, a number of schemes have already been in operation, which are enabling people to get into the jobs that are needed. So the Kickstart scheme, as I mentioned, 75 people, or 75,000 people already on that scheme. That's young people getting into work. But it's not just about that, it's about training people. There are short-term boot camps enabling people to get into the skilled jobs that they need.
Because you'll have heard from businesses already, and they're saying when there's a shortage, when demand goes up, then we are expected to pay drivers or whatever more money. Where does that money come from? I mean, do businesses pay out of their pocket and then claim it back from the consumer? Because if so, that's not growing the economy.
That's not. So you're absolutely right. That is not the answer. The answer is twofold. The answer is to give people jobs, high-skilled jobs, so that businesses can be more can increase their productivity. So if we get good people doing better skilled jobs, companies will be more efficient. And it's also about increasing productivity through technology. So the Chancellor talked today about AI and increasing innovation and technology to make businesses more competitive. And in those circumstances, you don't get costs passed on to the consumer. Actually, you get more productive companies producing things possibly at the same or lower prices.
It's a really honest answer, that, because what you're essentially saying is wait for a technological revolution, wait for people to be skilled, wait for people to finish their however many years of apprenticeship.
I mean,
but it comes back to the consumer now. If I'm a consumer now and I'm wondering what my Christmas dinner might cost me, or whether I'll get the ingredients for it, or whether the shortages will last as they are doing for months to come, you're not saying, no, we've sorted this out. We've got a pragmatic, the Chancellor said he was a pragmatist, not an ideologue. You're not saying we've got that sorted. You're saying wait for the technological revolution and the economy to turn around, right?
There are some things that will take time, and you heard Anne-Marie say there are some things that will take time, and there are some things that we can do and that we are doing right now. So one of those things is boot camps in relation to training up skills for people, HGV drivers, people in the construction industry. You've talked about agriculture. We already have 30,000 people on a seasonal agricultural workers scheme who can come into this country. We've already taken a large number of measures in a number of sectors, and there is already a cabinet committee
what are we going to do about that?
Who is looking at the issues that you raised.
What are we going to do about that Times front page story then? If only 27 people have applied from the EU to drive HGV fuel trucks, that suggests something's wrong. We're not going to keep the army on the roads driving our trucks for this long. So is it that they don't find the visas attractive enough because they're simply not long enough, and they don't get any healthcare whilst they're here, and it's in the run-up to Christmas, and why should they leave on New Year's Eve or whatever? I mean, are you going to start rethinking that, or do you say, oh, well, 27's fine, nobody else wants the job.
The government was always very clear that increasing the number of people who could come into this country was only one of a number of measures that they were putting in place in order to ensure that we had sufficient lorry drivers, HGV drivers. Another measure is increasing the training of our current drivers who want to get those skills. And the long-term plan is to improve the training so that we can get 50,000 additional people through the training. Further measures are expanding the licenses of those those drivers whose licenses are about to expire. So yes, it is possible to get people from Europe, but there are other measures that we're already putting in place to help British drivers here.
Lucy Fraser, thank you very much.
Thanks
for coming in. Now, Boris Johnson's flagship policy during the 2019 general election was, you'll remember, to level up the country. But 2 years into his premiership, some of his own MPs are questioning the delivery of this key government strategy. Jake Berry, chairman of the Northern Research Group of MPs, said today there's still no clarity about what levelling up actually means. And like all successful election slogans, levelling up means all things to all people. The new Secretary of State for Levelling Up, Michael Gove, has been brought in to provide vision and purpose to the agenda. But what does levelling up look like in practice, and how are the government getting on with its central mission? Here's our policy editor.
Help win them an election, help reshape Britain's electoral geography. But what does it even mean? Today, Michael Gove, newly in charge of the agenda as, what else, Levelling Up Secretary, was supposed to level up our understanding.
We also want to raise living standards, especially where they're lower. We want to improve public services, especially where they're weaker. And we also want to give people the resources necessary to enhance a sense of pride in the place where they live.
The question is, which government would disagree with any of that? It was also light on specifics. There's an old joke about asking 3 economists and getting 4 opinions. Well, here you might say the same thing about levelling up with Conservative activists.
What does levelling up mean?
What does levelling up mean?
Yeah.
As far as I understand it, it means giving everybody a fair crack of the whip.
Well, it means levelling up rather than levelling down. And there's a significant difference.
I mean, levelling up is what it says, you know, it's bringing things up to make sure that everybody's equal.
So it means basically putting people together of all different backgrounds in housing, raising them up so that the actual level of the average increases.
Right. The man himself didn't seem so keen to enlighten us.
No?
The government has never officially defined nor attached metrics for success. Initially, there was a sense it was about rebalancing between regions, closing the gap between north and south. Now it's used to mean economic growth everywhere. We asked the new Department for Levelling Up which it was, thinking if anyone would know, they would. They didn't answer the question directly, instead saying, levelling up is about spreading opportunity, boosting living standards and improving public services so that every part of the UK can thrive. The government will publish a white paper that will drive forward our central mission to level up every corner of the UK. Notable too was what wasn't in Gove's speech. No mention of planning reform or massive infrastructure, no specifics on more political devolution. And look who happened to be at conference to heap on the pressure.
I'll make it very plain. It's got to be about closing that north-south divide, creating the foundations here for a more productive economy, giving people opportunities that they don't currently have. That is what it means to me.
And do you think they're serious about it?
Well, it's obviously the theme of this conference, but the danger for them is if they leave it too vague for too long, it will become the next big society.
The problem is, Southern Conservative MPs bristle at such a clean north-south narrative.
What do you think levelling up means?
Levelling up is actually making sure that people on lower incomes in parts of the community that are struggling, actually you raise their incomes. And so this is, of course, a difficulty at the moment because we're seeing the cost of living rise. I mean, we've taken some years to try and level up school funding, for instance. So the idea what you do there is you don't actually lower somebody's income per child. You then raise the others to that level.
You're talking about it again, level up. You just mean increase school funding. So is that all it means? It's just a word for increase?
That's all part of it.
Well, in a way, it's perhaps unfair to expect unanimity when beneath the surface, this party is far from unanimous about anything.
Big problem for the Conservatives right now when thinking about levelling up is that in order to answer what it means, you'd first have to have more agreement within the Conservative Party about lots of other things, whether that's how much intervention there should be in the economy, about the balance between free markets and the state, how comfortable they should be about the tax burden. But for the first time, really since the 1970s, a lot of those questions in this party are in flux. There's not even really agreement between numbers 10 and 11. And until you have answers to those questions, until the party has worked up its mind about what it thinks, then really the danger for them is levelling up remains a slogan, an organising principle without much rigour to back it up.
Levelling up is the rhetorical glue of this conference. It's the agenda against which they will be judged. MPs whispered darkly, though, that without greater definition, they may yet come unstuck.
Lewis Goodall with that report. And joining us now, Neil O'Brien. Can I call you Minister for Levelling Up? Yeah. It works, doesn't it? Let's look at those comments from Jake Berry, one of your own MPs, who said there's still no clarity about what levelling up actually means. Like all successful election slogans, it means all things to all people, as we've had a taste of in Lewis's piece there. What would your response to Jake be? I mean, if he wanted a slogan-free response.
Yeah. Well, he's right. We've got to be totally clear. So levelling up is about four things. Firstly, it's about empowering local leaders and local communities and reversing the centralisation we've seen in this country. So we bring power closer to the people. Secondly, it's about improving the economy and living standards, particularly in places where it have been poorer for many, many years. Third, it's about spreading opportunity and improving public services, particularly where they're weaker. And fourth and finally, it's about restoring local pride. And that is partly about the way your town centre and your city centre feel. It's partly about having the absence of crime, but it's also about civic society and all the things that make life worth living. So we do have it's a good challenge from Jake. It's a perfectly reasonable challenge. We have to be clear about what it is. But those are the four objectives. And of course, behind them, there's lots of different policies that we're already working on and more to come.
So if Jake's response on hearing that was, you're trying to raise up the standard of living amongst people who need it, who may be losing £1,000 a year through cuts to universal credit, who are facing inflation on food prices, who are facing tax hikes on national insurance, instead of fancy ideology or sort of, I don't know, flowers in the town square, just put the money back in their pocket. You don't need a slogan. You just need to take very simple measures that will make people's lives instantly better.
And we are taking measures to make people's lives better. But there is a choice, right? You're pointed to a difficult choice, right, that none of us want to have to make between, do you want to spend the money on welfare or do you want to spend the money on job creation programmes like Restart?
Do you want to take money out of people's pockets and tell them that you're levelling up, or do you want to not tell them they're levelling up but just put the money back in?
So in the end, the government's got a certain amount of money from taxpayers, right? The government doesn't have any money of its own. We've got to take it off taxpayers if we want to spend money, right? So for a given budget, we've got some choices. Do we want to spend it on more welfare and more benefits, or do you want to create more jobs to give people more opportunities? I mean, we have spent tens of billions keeping unemployment low. We've now got unemployment down, a record number of vacancies. And that is not an accident, right? That is because we have spent billions of pounds on schemes like Kickstart. And in my constituency, I've met some of these young people, right?
Is it about fairness? Is it about...
It is about fairness.
Should the rich be taxed more to pay for the poor? Is that what it's about?
You can always say, and people will always be in politics saying, why don't we tax the rich more? Why don't we just add a bit more tax onto the rich?
But you're saying no.
Because the truth is that there's an upper limit, right? We'll do everything we can on tax avoidance. We've raised tens of billions by clamping down on that. We've brought in everything from, we've been leading the world in terms of our measures to avoid profit shifting and so on. At the same time, we've brought in new taxes like, higher CGT.
So we've now got the highest burden. I think Jacob Rees-Mogg said the highest burden since Wilson.
Exactly. So you've got to be very careful you don't just tax the economy to death. So in the end, we do have to make difficult choices about spending. The choice that we make is to create jobs, create opportunity, and to do things to fix the fundamentals of the economy. We're not trying to paper over the cracks with just hanging baskets, as you said. What we're trying to do is fundamentally make the economy of these places that have been weak for a long time, places where I grew up, and I saw the effects of the 1980s and 1990s recessions, and to fix the fundamentals of those economies so they can be stronger over the long term and not just rely on government handouts.
So one of those things could be the geography. And at the moment, we've spent years and years, probably a decade, looking at HS2, very much tied to George Osborne, very London-centric. Is there a shift, well, in the sense that it kind of came and went from London? Now, I guess what I'm asking is, does that priority have to shift? Do you have to east to west now? Is the old idea of HS2 sort of dying a quiet death?
I think it's funny you say that. I mean, if you're in Manchester, you might say it comes and goes from Manchester. If you're in Birmingham, you might say the same thing. So HS2...
But it goes up and down. I suppose that's what I'm saying.
It does go up and down. And you're right, we have to also do east-west as well. So in terms of rail, we are also committed to doing Northern Pass Rail to connect up all the great cities in the north. We're doing the same thing in the Midlands. I'm an East Midlands MP.
Should the Northern Power Rail come first?
Within weeks, we're going to be setting out our plans in terms of the integrated rail plan. We are going to be spending tens of billions upgrading our railways, east to west, as well as north to south. We're also spending tens of billions, you had Andy Burnham in your clip a minute ago, giving our cities new powerful transport budgets that joined up,
Neil,
also improving our roads. But of course, it's not just about transport. We're all very interested in better transport and that kind of opportunity, but it's also about our record investment in R&D, so make sure we've got the high skill, knowledge jobs of the future.
You're a new minister in this brand new department, and yet your party's been in government for 11 years. You have been advisor to both George Osborne and Theresa May. So fundamentally, there were big mistakes for that decade if you're only just looking at this now.
Well, we're obviously not just looking at this now. So I worked on the
But it
Northern
didn't
House
work.
when
Whatever
George Osborne...
happened then didn't work, right?
So none of these problems are going to be fixed overnight. I wouldn't say that. So when we came into government, we'd had a record rise in unemployment. We had the biggest deficit since the Second World War, and we had a lot of mess to clean up, right? And we had to do some difficult things that none of us wanted to do. And over time, we have been doing everything we can. You mentioned getting HS2 going. That's a long project. It's now, by the way, got 20,000 people working on it, digging massive tunnels. So it is all happening. It's not just an idea anymore. And we started the devolution agenda. We started it here in Manchester with the first devolution deal, empowering civic leaders to join up all the things that are going on in their community and really advocate for their places. So we have been doing a lot on this. It's not that we just started discovering these issues now. It's as things actually, as we come out of the global pandemic, as we come out of that massive fiscal deficit that we were inheriting, we've now got more scope to do more for the people who have been left behind in this country for too long.
Neil O'Brien, thank you very much, and thanks for joining us here on set in Manchester. Now, in a moment, you'll be pleased to know we'll be going to our political panel for their take on the day that's been and the ones ahead. But first, Nick's back. Just hop back with a bit of news about tomorrow, Nick.
Yeah, so day 3 tomorrow, and as you heard in my film, this space was the Manchester Nightingale Hospital, and tomorrow we will hear from the Health Secretary, Sajid Javid, and then 2 big speeches on law and order. So in the first place, we'll hear from Dominic Raab, the new Justice Secretary and Deputy Prime Minister, and he will announce that he's setting aside £183 million to nearly double the number of people on tags. That's an increase by £26,000. The government is talking about how that will include 10,000 more thieves and burglars who will be GPS tagged over the next 3 years to prevent them reoffending and keeping them away from their victims. Then we will hear from Priti Patel, the Home Secretary, and it will be a crackdown on the Insulation Britain and Extinction Rebellion protests. So the Home Secretary will say yes to the fundamental right to protest, but no to disruption. She will talk about how she's going to criminalise the interference with key infrastructures, that's roads, railways and the free press. And then there'll be new stop and search powers for the police. For example, if they suspect protesters of gluing themselves to a building, they'll be able to stop and search them.
Nick, thanks very much indeed. Well, joining us now, Camilla Tominey, Danny Finkelstein and Ian Dale. Danny, I'm going to start with you because it is over to business. Pretty much that's where we are now, with the government saying they've got to sort this out. You know, that they're not going to be helped with a huge number of visas or whatever. Is that a gamble for the Conservatives, or is it the only thing they can say at this point?
Well, both. Look, the government has a central policy, which is important to understand it. The central policy was to leave the European Union. This is a bigger policy than anything else it'll do. It's still, as David Frost's speech showed, trying to sort that out. It's going to have an impact on the supply chain, which everyone was arguing from the beginning, and it's going to force the government to reorganise its whole policy on wages and how people earn and what people do for a living. So naturally, that's going to cause quite a lot of dislocation. It's causing that at the moment. whether you think the government's answers are convincing on this will depend to some extent on whether you thought that central idea was a good one, which I didn't. We can't talk about any of these policies without considering that really very big decision.
Camilla, do you think people, the public, do have a tolerance for it? Do you think they do understand what the end game is here, or do you think that patience is sort of running out?
Well, I think Boris Johnson is trying to sell this idea that it's short-term pain for long-term gain, and that equally the electorate accepts that he's been hit by this pandemic, you know, which came completely out of the blue, and therefore there needs to be a period of adjustment. But as you say, it's a question of patience and how long it's going to take. From the government's perspective, we've had talk on this conference floor that there might be an election by 2023, not 24. You know, that's not that much time to try and make up for.
Not in our timetable, is it? We start thinking about these things way too early.
Well, also, they'll want to see some benefit. You know, this idea of bringing in a military chief, for instance, to try and instigate some savings in the NHS, you know, they'll want to be able to produce those, and they'll want to be able to say, come the next election, whenever it is, you know, we have driven down waiting times. Otherwise, people are going to be saying, well, why am I paying more NIC contributions and not seeing anything in result?
Do you feel, Ian, this is quite a united party? I mean, you know, when you think that they weren't here last time and that they've been here in very troubled times, you know, all the divisions over Brexit, does this feel like a very united party this time round, or do you feel sort of inside the ideological pulls that Lewis Goodall was sort of talking about there between what kind of party they want to be now?
There are always pulls in any political party, and they always want to appear united because the electorate doesn't generally vote for parties that appear disunited. And I think one of the coming battles is going to be between those people who look back at the 1980s and think, well, we were low tax, small state Tories. What are we now? If we're not that, what are we? But of course, Boris Johnson can look back to 1981, that budget where Margaret Thatcher put up taxes and then later cut them. So he has got some historical precedent there on his side. But I mean, if you go to the fringe meetings around the conference, Emily, there are lots of people having these debates. And I mean, personally, I think that I will never see a low tax, small state economy again in my lifetime. I think that ship has sailed, because it will, even though unemployment has not reached the levels that all the economists told us it would after COVID. I mean, obviously we don't know what's going to happen over the next couple of months at the end of furlough, but the economy is in a much better state than I think anyone would have predicted. But I think that the big state is going to be with us for a substantial length of time. And it's how the Conservative Party manages to reconcile itself to that.
And it was quite interesting, Danny, just listening to Rishi Sunak give that big sort of round of, you know, sort of accolades for his leader, Boris Johnson. What do you think that relationship is like? Do you think he's sort of sick of playing the bad guy, you know, the fiscally responsible, to sort of, you know, the party go Johnson?
I think he announced the pact between them, and the pact between them is Boris Johnson's going to push for more spending, which Rishi Sunak doesn't think is a particularly good idea. Rishi Sunak is going to accept that he's the Prime Minister, but if he does want to announce a spending programme, Rishi Sunak's going to insist that he pays for it at the same time. And that's why that speech was, rather than being a low tax speech, because it was quite, you know, he talked about pragmatism, it was a very fiscally conservative speech. It was about not having borrowing, and that is the deal that they've done. So Boris Johnson can't have upfront spending, which the Chancellor doesn't see the receipts for, and that will make that is itself politically risky, by the way, because people want to be better off, and one of the ways you can make them better off in the short term for an election is borrowing. But I think Rishi Sunak is convinced that if you run in an election,
Camilla, which do you think is more popular right now to the sort of to the party? Is it the idea that you go back to being the fiscally responsible, or is it, you know...
Depends on who you ask. I mean, there's some kind of Tory grey hairs who are saying, why not just add it onto borrowing, because it's already at an all-time high and you can treat it like a war debt. And there are newer Conservatives who I've spoken to today, like Red Wallers, who say, actually, on the doorstep, this tax rise, it's not playing too badly, and they understand it. And I think, you know, Danny's right there. There was this sense of the Chancellor trying to say that he was going to have to make the tough decisions, and that's his way of demonstrating fiscal discipline. You know, having said that, Boris Johnson isn't going to want to have his wings clipped OK, he came into this role with huge ambitions, big infrastructure projects, spending, behaving in exactly the way that he behaved as London Mayor. He's been kind of stilted in that ambition for 2 years. So there's always going to be these tensions between, you know, a big spending PM and a Chancellor that needs to claw back the cost of COVID.
Would he be looking at the polling, the YouGov polling that says if the election was held today, his majority would be halved and Labour would gain 18 red wall seats? I mean, you know, you've got that on one hand, and then you've got the Boris Johnson can do no wrong sort of polls on the other. What?
Well, I'll tell you what, I think a lot of people in his entourage would probably sort of settle for that. If you're going to get a 40-seat majority in the next general election, you'd
have
bank
it
that
tomorrow
now, wouldn't you? But I think there is a great divide coming, and we've seen it. I mean, after his Andrew Marr interview on Sunday, which I thought, apart from the policing question, was an absolute car crash for him. But interestingly, and this shows where he's such a lucky politician in many ways. We're now all talking about this supposed divide between if you vote Tory, you're going to get a pay rise. If you vote Labour, you're going to get mass immigration and pay cuts maybe, or lower wages. I mean, that is a pretty powerful dividing line. It may be a crude one. It may be a sort of rather uncomfortable one for many people. But I suspect when that is focus group, you'll find that goes down very well with a lot of the people that he needs to keep on board.
Danny, we're looking ahead at tomorrow. Immigration for Priti Patel, the Home Secretary. Can a Conservative Home Secretary ever sound too hard on immigration in a party conference hall?
Yes, you can sometimes misjudge the mood. I think people, it depends a little bit what the mood is, but I think people can tell when someone's being crass or inauthentic, actually, in a party conference. But certainly you do want a tough message on it because they think voters do and they do too. But again, as with the point that Ian raised, these things do play well as slogans, but people do expect some delivery, particularly on the economy. So, you know, whether people's wages actually rise, I think the polls for the Conservatives at the moment are remarkably good, considering the situation that we're in. But whether they'll still be good at the next general election depends entirely on whether the government begins to deliver on people getting higher wages. And you've been asking some very pertinent questions about the timing of that. You asked that to Neil O'Brien and to Lucy Fraser, and I think that they are the question, really, on which the next general election will revolve.
Also, just remember, the demographics of the Conservative Party have changed massively. If you wander around this conference, the Blue Rinse Brigade has gone. They're not here. The demographic here is 20 to 40. It's not 60 to 80. And that means that a lot of social attitudes have changed. You can't just sort of tickle the party's G-spot with a hardline speech on capital punishment or immigration and expect the kind of response that you would have got in the 1980s.
So, I mean, that is an extraordinary feat in itself, isn't it?
Yeah.
To
also,
pull down your demographic by 20 years.
And also, look at it geographically. You know, they win Hartlepool and they lose Chesham and Amersham. You know, so that changes the demographic completely. But if you're Boris Johnson, why wouldn't you occupy the centre ground? You know, there's nobody threatening him now on the right. You know, Nigel Farage is over on a rival show. And even if people did galvanise behind him because of Brexit, he was devoid of domestic policy. So, you know, maybe there's a sense in which he can take traditional Tories for granted somewhat and, you know, be the heir to Blair.
We'll wrap it up here on that extraordinary note.
On that bombshell.
I think he's on the other channel. Thank you all very much for joining us here. Goodbye from us here in Manchester, but I'm back tomorrow. Join us then. Hope you do. Bye-bye.